Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Evolving Solutions Lunch webinar. Today we're going to be talking about trends in data protection, which I'm really excited about. It's something we've had on the agenda to try to cover for several weeks now, and I'm glad that we're finally getting around to it today. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. Really value your time and your attention. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A panel during the webinar today. If you have any suggestions on either content for future webinars or feedback on the value of these webinars, we would absolutely love to hear it. You can certainly reach out to me or respond to the note that you received with your confirmation today, and we'll be very happy to take that feedback. I know most of you are familiar with Evolving Solutions, but before I make too many assumptions, I just thought I would go ahead and give you a little bit of background. Evolving Solutions is a technology solutions provider. We are focused on modernizing and automating really mission-critical application infrastructure, as well as helping our clients transform their business as their IT infrastructure moves forward. The other thing that I would take a moment to call to your attention is what we call our hybrid cloud philosophy, which is really that cloud is not a place, cloud is a set of disciplines. And I can give a nod to my guest today, Ted Lutovsky, for helping craft that slogan for us. That's something that is really critical for us. And that plays into a bigger context that a lot of these webinars have been based around, which is what we call modern operations. And really, we started talking to our clients more aggressively in the last 4 or 5 years about what they wanted to see us do going forward. And one of the things that continually came up as a theme is the idea that we've got to keep our legacy business, our business-critical applications and infrastructure running, and we also need to respond to the needs of a new set of constituents, developers, a new set of internal business needs, and nobody's doubling our budget to do it. So really, modern operations is about finding the processes and the capabilities and the tools that allow our clients to be able to add value in their existing environment, as well as to get the capabilities that they need in order to move forward. And so data protection is actually one of those capabilities, data management more broadly, but data protection is really a critical piece of that modern operations. There are many things that you can do to improve your operational capability for your existing environment around data protection that also give you a leg up in delivering the capabilities that your business expects to have and that your developers expect to have in a new environment. So with that context, that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to take a minute to introduce Mr. Ted Lutovsky. Ted is an enterprise architect with Evolving Solutions. Ted's been here for, is it 3 years now, Ted? Did I get that right? Great.
Indeed.
That went by kind of fast. Ted has been with us for 3 years now, has had an extensive career in the IT space, a lot of it in storage and data protection, and I've had a number of conversations with him over the years about data protection and the kinds of solutions that we can offer in that space, the kinds of things we help clients with, not to mention the trends that are happening in that area. I would also just add that one of the things that led to this series of webinars is our internal team talking about how much they enjoyed the conversations they had, that they got to have along with our technical team during weekly meetings and so on. And so we wanted to take that and try to bring it out to our clients. And so that's sort of what sparked this, and hopefully we'll deliver a little bit of that today. I'm going to just jump right in. Give me 1 minute there, and off we'll go. So one of the things that I was going to talk to Ted a little bit about, so I know that you've done a lot of data protection and storage in your life. Data protection for some people is maybe not the most exciting or interesting thing in the world. How did you end up spending so much of your career and time on data protection?
Well, I think that's a really good question. The reality is most people do a lot of data protection, but don't realize that they're creating data protection, right? Anytime you copy your data off, anytime you say, hey, this is my primary data repository, and even if you're just a home user, desktop user, laptop user, you end up copying data out to a USB drive. You end up emailing yourself or somebody else a copy and keeping a copy of that, right? So when we talk about data protection and data management, we're actually having a pretty big, interesting conversation. Part of it is, how do I make sure that I retain my data, I retain it in usable formats? How do I know how to get back to it? Am I thinking about having more than one version, right? Anybody that's edited a paper and then realized, oh my God, I don't have an old copy of the paper and I really wish I could get back there, recognizes the value of versioning or version control. So I would say what's really led to me being so interested in the subject, and what's really led to that being important at Evolving Solution, is that customers have always wanted to protect their environments. But there's a difference between protecting the environment, protecting the data, and as we'll talk about more later, now we are beginning to see customers who are beginning to realize that they're actually also trying to protect their workflow, the outcome of the business, and that's become more available, more line of sight to the people that are actually doing the data protection.
And that makes a ton of sense. I agree. It's interesting. I personally don't do a lot of data protection conversations because I got an expert that can take care of a lot of that for me. But what you just touched on is the thing that I have definitely seen more and more of our clients asking about, which is sort of what's the next thing? And it usually starts with what's new and interesting in data protection.
Oh, that's a big question. So let's take that in pieces if I can. I would say that the first thing is technology continues to roll forward. We have now seen that people who really think about data protection as I'll back up to a tape or tapes, that's still here, it's still around. The technology has now reached the point, though, where it's possible for a single tape drive to ingest data at 750 megabytes a second. And if you're not really a storage person, that may or may not be super interesting to you, but those kinds of speeds are things that we used to only see out of big storage arrays. So now we can push huge amounts of data at very high speed into tapes, and that really requires a re-architecture of how we do that kind of data protection. We also see that people are backing up in multiple iterations. So because it's so hard to feed these new tape drives, we're seeing people back up to network shares, to NASs, or backing up to local disk storage, and then from that location, figuring out where to put their data. Another big trend in that where locality is cloud. Do I want to back up on-prem? And if I do back up on-prem, do I only want it to be on-prem, whether that's one site or two sites or multiple sites? Or do I want to think about putting that in some public cloud provider like Amazon or Azure? And that also requires rethinking questions about capacity, throughput, and questions of what kind of connectivity, right? So we understand it's easy for us inside the data center to understand, do I need a bigger SCSI cable or more fiber channel ports or a faster network? But then when we think about putting things in the cloud, does that also mean I might need a bigger network connection up into my internet provider? So I would say those are probably the initial high level, let's call them plumbing and infrastructure questions that have to do with data protection.
That makes sense.
If you'd like me to keep going, I could talk about some of the more interesting technology trends that have less to do with what the data lives on and more to do with how we're protecting it. I would say,
it's interesting because I mean, that's what I end up talking to clients about, and that's, I think, even though I end up calling you up to help create a technical architecture, we're really solving the business problem most of the time. So I think that's a good reflection. What are the sort of ways that people are doing business that have changed that are impacting that, if that makes sense?
Oh, okay. So the first thing is we're beginning to see that IT itself has better insight, better understanding into the line of business. We see that in ITIL training. We see that in green belt and ISO processes. That what's beginning to happening is that business as a whole is communicating better and communicating with IT. So now IT is learning to be more responsive to the needs of business. And that means that instead of some of these older, slower, monolithic processes, we're beginning to see IT needing to be automated and orchestrated so that as the business becomes more responsive to the public, to their customers, IT becomes more responsive. So one of those big high-level trends is that we're seeing, regardless of data protection methodology, we're beginning to see more and more of that become automated. And at Evolving Solutions, when we use the term automated, we're talking about repeatable process in a single silo. We're also beginning to see what we think of as greater orchestration, which we would define as multiple silos of automation. So that not only am I talking about having an automatic and scheduled backup, but I might also have that schedule then afterwards do replication to a different site, maybe even a tertiary copy up into the cloud, and maybe even then doing some analytics around the data once it's in that location. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, I mean, you just touched on a couple of things. One is automation, and we'll come back to that in a little bit maybe, but that idea of doing analytics against data and using that backup data, not only analyzing it, but potentially using it for other things is another sort of trend I think we're seeing from a lot of our clients.
Right. And to be fair, I don't think that there's a lot of surprise to that trend. A lot of big business looks at ways to improve what we'll call their availability. And we should probably define a few terms, right? When we think about business continuity and disaster recovery, we're really talking about how do I get back if I have a failure of some kind. When we talk about, when we generally are talking about high availability, we're really talking about how do I survive a failure of some component or series of components without actually stopping work in the first place, right?
Sure.
So we regularly see businesses that have data centers where some of the infrastructure is highly available, or maybe even highly available between the two data centers, right? The problem is that represents a substantial investment. So we see industry looking for ways to use that infrastructure in the interim. So I'm not just waiting for a failure. I find financially productive ways to use that infrastructure. So by the same token, if I'm generating data, which is one of the outputs of business, right? Then backing up that data might involve me putting it off-site in a second location, in that second data center, or up in the cloud. Well, wouldn't it be nice if I can gain insights from that data, but not necessarily have to impede or slow down my production environment to do that, right? So we see people taking advantage of their data protection methodologies as a natural extension of people taking advantage of their higher availability environments and recapping that value. Plus, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, data itself is the new natural resource. Customers have been generating data forever, but only in the last few years have people become really aware of the fact that there might be a huge amount of value and insight to be gathered out of data that you already have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so you hit on an important point there, I think, in terms of just being able to get additional value out of the data. One of the things I know I've seen pretty consistently is how do I take a set of that data and potentially use it for test or use it for some other kind of environment like that. And again, to me, that's one of the places where cloud plays an interesting role, because if I've got a backup set there, I can lay out that backup data and use it as a test set in an environment that I can expand and contract. That's interesting. What are the other kinds of things that public cloud has impacted for data protection that you've seen?
Well, absolutely, and we should talk about that in a couple of different directions, right? The first is that as public cloud becomes more robust and more feature-rich, we see customers willing to not just do data protection in the cloud, they'll do workloads up in the cloud. Or you'll hear the term cloud burst, which is pretty much an industry generic term for if my data center doesn't have enough performance or headway, then I can also do some work in the cloud. And so,
well, the great thing about the term cloud burst is that 10 years ago that was actually a disaster in the data center. Now it's like
right. Absolutely. So first, it is possible now to not only back up to the cloud, to take data and push it into the cloud to protect it, but many of the data protection schemas that we're seeing now, we're capable of spinning up virtual instances that live adjacent to the data. So rather than the significant both penalty in time and possibly a financial penalty of egressing data, if I've already backed the data up into the cloud, then what if I want to spin up a workload adjacent to that data? Now, that data might be in a backup format, so I may technically still need to extract it. But if I have a virtual instance of my backup application, then I can now extract that data, leave it in the cloud, and perform all kinds of behavior against it. An example of that, and an example that's really applicable to analytics, is that it's very possible to take backup data that's data protection data, and then turn that into a usable data set and perform, say, a Hadoop workload, which then gives me all kinds of insights and analytics against the data. Well, when I'm done, I still have the original data protected format data. I can now delete the working set. I no longer need it, and I still have those insights readily available. On the complete other side of that universe, the question is, what happens if I created a workload that's cloud native? What happens if I built an app or an entire series of applications that never started in my data center? They always lived in the cloud. Well, at a certain point, if those are generating business, if those are generating revenue, then it's very likely the case that those are also going to be generating data. As much as we would like to have confidence in all of public and hybrid cloud, we also still need to think about the fact that the disciplines of data protection don't stop because things are resident in the cloud, right? That's one of the reasons why we at Evolving think that cloud is a series of disciplines. If I'm going to think about doing data protection in my data center, I'm also going to think about how do I protect data for applications and workflows that are cloud native. Now, in that environment, the convenience is, again, I may have some methodologies in place. I may have an application, a data protection application, that makes it very possible for me to back up the data into a different format and leave it inside the cloud. Now, if I have a regulatory reason or something else, I may also be able to extract that in a data protected format, replicate it down to my data center. And in a cloud environment, I do want to think about things like having my data in multiple regions, talking about my SLAs for how long it takes me to move it to a region, or what the heat of the storage is, in the sense of, do I want, we'll use Amazon as an example, do I want regular Amazon data, or is it possible I might want to push it out to Glacier? But the mechanisms and paradigms around having workload in the cloud still involve us asking the same kinds of questions, still involve using those data protection disciplines in the cloud as well as in our local data centers.
And so you bring up another great point, which is those disciplines stay the same. The other piece of the challenge or discipline required to do data protection is restoration. So as you always remind me, backing it up is easy, restoring it is hard. So I think maybe you could talk a little bit about how public cloud and hybrid cloud have impacted sort of restore paradigms and the way people go about restoring their data.
Sure. But before we do that, I'd like to take a half a step to the side because I want to talk about how we think about different kinds of data protection and how those different kinds of data protections impact recovery, how long it takes to do that. We recognize in the same way that earlier in the conversation, I mentioned, hey, it would be really nice if I had a version control over my Office document, right? We regularly see customers create snapshots. Now, whether those snapshots are done in software, so VMware is very capable of snapping a virtual machine at an exact moment in time, or whether those snapshots are done in hardware, which is something that we also see regularly, that enterprise environments often have very powerful and intelligent storage subsystems that are capable of doing hardware-level snapshots of the LUNs that are presented, of the storage that's presented. Are snapshots data protection all by themselves? That's an awfully gray and soft question. Yes, they are. They give me an ability to roll back, but the problem is if my snapshots live on the same array that the primary data lived on, if I lose the array, I didn't just lose my production workload, I also lost all of those snapshots, right? But there's a powerful attraction to snapshots because the amount of time it takes me to either roll a snap back or mount that snapshot and get the data out of it is extremely brief, almost real time. And that means that my recovery time objective for that data set is almost instantaneous. Business thinks that's very attractive, right? So how do we solve that problem? We can solve that problem without using a unique data protection application if, as I'd already talked about in earlier instances, well, what if I have more than one data center? What if I have arrays, storage systems in 2 or more locations, and not only am I replicating the storage between them, but I'm creating snapshots and replicating those snapshots to my secondary location. Now, does that data protection? Absolutely it is, because now I have the ability to get the data off of the primary array and on a snapshot somewhere else. So if I have a site failure, a primary site failure, I still have that data and it's almost instantly available. And if I needed to fail over as much as even the entire data center, I now have that data in a secondary location, and not just the most current version, but snapshots going back in time, which allow me to do other things like how do I address malware problems and things like that.
Sure.
So when we talk about recovery time objective and recovery point objective, I want to make sure that people are clear that infrastructure, intelligent infrastructure, is capable of helping us achieve data protection methodologies by doing replications and snapshots, right? However, Evolving Solutions doesn't think that that's a very complete solution. And the reason it's not necessarily a complete solution is because certain kinds of failures, if I have data corruption on my primary array, I might very well replicate that to the second. If I have a malware issue and I don't know when it happened, I may have replicated those same problems, whatever that time bomb or that ticking clock is, I may have also replicated that to the far side. So we hear people use the term air-gapped a lot, which is really a generic term for data that I've pulled out of my primary environment completely, usually on a tape or something like it, and placed it where it's not accessible to production at all. Now, whether that's a physical air gap, I've ejected a tape, I've removed disks and stuck them in a safe, or whether it's a logical air gap, we can achieve very common results, right? And that becomes one of the balances that business has to figure out, is how important is it to have both the data, the security of the data versus the time to restore. And we see that most of our customers do both. They'll have some combination of snapshots and replication to protect certain kinds of data to restore it very, very quickly. And then they will also have some methodology, whether that's backing up to tape, whether that's backing up to cloud, whether that's backing up to some of the newer technologies, which we'll talk about hopefully more. But that data set becomes a little less online, a little more offline, a little less nearline. And those methodologies combined together create a bigger data protection schema.
So why don't we dig a little bit into those newer technologies that you mentioned around restore and that sort of data protection piece as it relates to ransomware or other
Sure.
kinds of
Sure. So I'm going to go old school for a minute then, and I'm going to talk about the oldest of the new technologies, right? So I've talked about backing up and restoring from tape, and I've talked about backing up to like a file share NAS or to a storage environment, right? One of the technologies that we see that's still a very solid argument for customers is something called a VTL, in short, a virtual tape library. What that is usually a storage array with a certain kind of abstraction or virtualization technology in front of it that allows it to represent itself, excuse me, as if it was a tape library.
Sure.
And the appeal of a virtual tape library, of a VTL, is that it allows your data protection application and your model for doing that to continue more or less unchanged, if that made sense, right? Absolutely. So in a VTL environment, rather than changing out tapes or doing other things and worrying about that performance paradigm, the VTL hides all of that. So I get disk speeds, disk restoral speeds, but behavior that doesn't require my administrators to change what they're doing. And then whether I want to use my backup application or whether I just want to use the intelligence in the VTL, I can replicate from one VTL to another VTL to get off site. Did that make sense? Sure. So in a very real way, I would argue that's the oldest new technology, right?
Sure. Well, that makes sense.
I would go a step further, and now we're beginning to see backup applications that are virtualized or para-virtualized. They are designed to live in both virtual environments and often in cloud environments, right? So traditionally, let's call it 10 years ago, most of our backup applications were fairly monolithic and meant to live on physical environments and protected data from that point of view. So as the applications themselves have become more and more involved, more aware of virtualized environments, the data protection environments themselves have become more distributed. That's very convenient in the sense that I can now move the data movers near to where the data is. And that includes the ability, as I talked about earlier, well, what if I am backing up into the cloud? I can put data movers up in the cloud with that. So if I need to restore that data set, rather than having to pull it all the way back down into my data center, I have the ability to restore adjacent to the data and restore inside the cloud. The next big trend is now we're also beginning to see, let's call them appliance-based or hyper-converged data protection methodologies, right? So where the application and the infrastructure are bundled together in such a way, and quick tangent, for customers that are not super familiar with hyperconverged, you should think of that as a new consumption and performance methodology for acquiring infrastructure, where historically in what we call three-tier infrastructure, storage, network, and compute are often entirely independent of each other, and we acquire them and use them independently. Hyperconverged environments are simply methodologies for bundling all those things together, and then we can acquire them and consume them very granularly together so that we don't scale them unreasonably from each other. So in a data protection methodology, when we talk about some of these hyperconverged data protection models, we find ourselves with the ability to create essentially a data protection grid. And every time we add a node to that grid, the grid improves its performance, its connectivity, its throughput, and its capacity. Also, because these are very modern applications, we see that there's a much higher degree of intelligence in them, that they're capable of indexing the data, creating metadata. They're capable of creating some things that are really exciting. Much of what we do in data protection is about data that we'll call unstructured data. It's not necessarily a database. It's not necessarily well organized. So as we protect vast quantities of unstructured data in days of old, well, in order to really look at that data, we either had to restore it or our data protection application had a database that you might be able to query or you might be able to comb through. That was sometimes awkward and painful. Often with these newer hyperconverged, let's call them 21st century data protection models, that information is readily apparent from the time it was backed up, which also means that I can get tremendous efficiencies of deduplication and compression. If I recognize that it is the same file and I've fingerprinted that file in such a way that I know there were no differences, then perhaps I don't have to store as many copies of that, because I can do pointer-based magic and say, look, we recognize that this file lives in 8 different backups, but this is the same file, so we'll just keep hanging on to it. We also find that some of these products are capable of doing things as novel as without restoring all the data. So one of the difficulties that people recognize as having been solved was it used to be very difficult to back up data inside a virtual machine. Now we have a lot of technology that's capable of backing up the entire virtual machine as one big object, one big file, and then cracking it open, looking inside, and pulling a file or two out of that. And that's been solved for a while. Most data protection products and platforms can solve that effortlessly. What is still difficult is when I do these big, huge, large backups of these unstructured data sets. Often in order to get at that data, I have to crack them open and restore them, right? But some of these new applications are capable of virtually opening them and extracting just a few files, or creating a share that actually I can directly connect to and copy out those files or use them as they exist in that environment without having to go through all the steps and pain of doing restorals first, right? And all of these new hyperconverged products also have virtual editions. So if I'm out on the edge in very, very small virtualized and hyperconverged environments where I may not want to place large data protection schemas, I can have virtual instances living in the environment and replicating that data back to a larger instance. Also, all of these are capable of backing up doing data protection directly into public cloud environments such as S3. And because of that, I can also take those virtual instances and again, put them in the cloud adjacent to that data if I had a need to restore or perform analytics or gain insights out of that data in those locations.
And so I think you talked about some of these 21st century data platforms. I think the other thing to me that's really interesting about some of these platforms is they've sort of, they've built out, because they're 21st century, the other thing we think about besides hyperconverged was sort of a way of thinking about giving a more public cloud experience inside of a data center. The other thing that's critical to that is around APIs and the ability to do automation around APIs. And a lot of times you and I have talked about automation. You talked before about the silos and the different, within a silo automation. So I think about things like self-service restore and some things like that that are sort of inside of a silo in some ways. There's APIs that have emerged out of these new products, give us some other capabilities. And I think you described this to me as the sandwich that I get, that those modern data protection capabilities give me some analytics and reporting that I get. My data sort of is in the middle of the flip side of that as I get some automation capabilities I didn't have before.
Right. So let's actually drill into that for a minute. Again, it's useful to automate and orchestrate workloads, right? It saves us a great deal of time. The problem is, without reporting, I have very little way of knowing how effective that is. It's a lot like if I don't do good reporting and good analytics against my process, it's a lot like driving my car down the road and only knowing if I've gone too far by hitting the rumble bumps on the side of the road. That might be a strategy. I'm not sure I would recommend it. So in the same way, we see a lot of these new data protection applications. They're using RESTful APIs, modern interfaces, multiple languages for scripting. And not only can I automate and orchestrate them and tie them into other automation platforms, but I also, because of these APIs, I'm capable of tying them into reporting abstraction layers as well, right? So that we at Evolving care a great deal about enterprise monitoring and analytics. We believe that that is an important feedback loop, right? That as business changes, as business pivots on its heel to follow the needs of customers and IT follows along with it, if we aren't reporting against that, how do we truly know when we were successful? We're not just looking at how long did the backup take. We actually want to know what got backed up, where did it go, how smoothly did that happen, what was the amount of time that it took, were there any host interruptions, were there any network interruptions? These kinds of feedback give us ways and means and insights into how we can continue to tweak and tune to make things faster, to make things more robust. And we see that aligning a great deal with the enterprise IT, the big picture, that as infrastructure technology, as IT as a whole learns to do this, that data protection also needs to follow right along with it. I would ask the question of anybody listening, if we recognize that there's a tremendous value to be had in automating and orchestrating our workloads, our IT, then why wouldn't we want to continue that behavior and follow that trend in data protection as well?
I completely agree. I think you mentioned a little bit about enterprise monitoring and analytics, and obviously that's important to us, but it's another sort of piece of modern operations that we see is that's some place that we get some value that helps, to Ted's point, helps the existing environment become more efficient and robust. It also allows us to do cloudy things where I've got literally millions of items that need to be strung together and kept track of, and there's no way to sort of avoid doing some level of monitoring in order to be able to effectively do that. I will throw out that we've got a little bit of time left. I want to ask Ted about one more area. If you've got questions that you'd like me to share with Ted, please feel free to pop things into the Q&A. I'm more than happy to do that. But we've covered a whole bunch of stuff, Ted. I'm going to ask you to maybe come down to a little bit more practical example of a couple places, what are some things you would recommend for our clients to improve their existing data protection environment that have nothing to do with the vendor, product, whatever else? What are the kinds of things that they ought to be going and looking at right now to make that environment work better?
Ooh, that's a great question. So the first thing I'm going to say is that in the same way that ITIL and things like it were meant to help IT communicate with the line of business and vice versa, to have line of business communicate in a language IT understands. One of the things that is the most surprising and sometimes upsetting is when we are doing data protection or disaster recovery, we see that that process is not always caught up. So a good example of that is the infrastructure might be capable of failing over right away, or it might be capable of doing restores in a very brief amount of time. But sometimes that process is business impacting. And so you might not know how far up in management you need to go to get somebody to say, yes, I'm going to declare the disaster. I want you to do what you have to do to solve the problem. So along with building out this marvelous modern infrastructure, along with building out automation and orchestration, I would say that it becomes important for the business to build out their communication model and their decision model, right? That the people time, the decision time is also crucial to what we're doing. I would also say that we recognize that the value of cloud, that the value particularly of public cloud has to do with its flexibility and its responsiveness, right? One of the things that's very attractive about public cloud is my ability to produce a credit card, answer a series of questions, and get what I want in a very short amount of time. But if we ask ourselves the question, what does our private data center look like, and how is my own data center different than the public cloud? Why does my data center not look like Amazon's? The answer is it probably does look very much the same, right? The difference is that we need to rethink our data centers so that they behave as private cloud, right? If the conversation is that cloud isn't a location, it's a series of disciplines. If we apply those disciplines to our own data centers, then it becomes sort of a logical extension that we can get that same flexibility, that same responsiveness, that same resilience inside the data center. But when we do that, that also means that data protection is going to have to follow along, right? So one of the trends we've only just barely scratched the surface on, as an example, is containerization, right? Containers are becoming very important to a lot of businesses, but they require a bit of rethinking. We know that when we're looking at virtual machine methodologies, we still tend to back up virtual machines in much the same way we back up physical machines. We could just do it faster because we know the virtual machine is a file. But containers are meant to be stateless. So we rarely want to or need to back up a container. Now, the template the container is founded on, we absolutely want to protect those, right? And the data set that the container is either creating or utilizing, or often both, again, we want to protect that as well. So answering your question from that point of view, regardless of product, regardless of application, when you say, so what kinds of things can we do? If the first answer is people, processes, and that model of organizing, the second thing is recognizing that if the workload has changed, if the workload has become more cloud-like, more container-like, more fluid, then our data protection methodology has to be the same. We have to be able to, for want of a better way to say it, we have to be able to chase the workload, right? We know that at the end of the day, data protection is often about protecting data. built into the name. But really what we're also doing is we're protecting workloads, we're protecting workflows. And so when we build out data protection models, we want to know the same kinds of questions. Where is the workload going to occur? Where is the data being generated? And how do we most efficiently protect it there?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate it. I think we probably could have gone on for another 90 minutes easily. There's a lot to cover in data protection, and I'm just continually blown away by your sort of wealth of knowledge and just time you take to think about data protection separately in the context of what's happening in the rest of the IT environment is, I'm grateful to have you as part of the team, and I'm really glad you're here at Evolving. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I would invite you all to come and join us over the next couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to talk more specifically sort of from an architectural perspective about hybrid cloud and what that means and what kinds of things you need to take into consideration as you architect a hybrid cloud. The week after that, I'm going to take a week off and invite Phil back to sort of host a panel with some of our technical team around VDI. We've done quite a bit of VDI work recently, as you might imagine, with some changes in the way people are consuming IT, and some really interesting insights from the team on sort of what to do with day 2 on VDI around assessing performance and stability. And we talked a little bit about data protection automation today. We're going to, in a couple of weeks, talk even greater detail about storage automation with some specific use cases, and even share some code and some approaches that we've taken to a couple specific instances. So if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into how we deal with storage automation, we'd love to have you join us that week. So thank you all for joining today. You should get a link with a link to the recording of the presentation within the next couple of days, along with a short survey, I believe. If you receive that, we would greatly appreciate you taking just a couple minutes to answer a couple questions. How easy was it to get on? What kind of value did you receive from this? What kind of topics would you like to see? So thank you all again for joining, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, Ted. And
thank you.